Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can help me make it better in two ways. Number one is you can simply go and write a review on iTunes, or number two is you can go to interviewthefuture.com and simply make a donation. Today, my guest on the show is Cory Doctorow. Cory is probably my all-time most favorite science fiction writer, and the reason for that is because he's not only a great storyteller, which he is, but also he is actually a very engaged activist. In other words, to paraphrase Karl Marx a bit, writers have tried to capture and describe the world, but the point, however, is to change it. So, Cory Doctorow, welcome to Singularity FM.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be back. Nice to talk to you, and thank you for that lovely introduction. That's very kind of you.
Fantastic. It's been 6 years since our previous conversation, and I have to say, I've been looking forward to this so much. So I have a plan for the next 90 minutes, and the main three parts that I want us to hit are this. First, I want to discuss your latest two books, which are phenomenal, and we're going to get into that in a bit. Second, I want to discuss sort of the major issues that our civilization is facing today and whether and how those two books are connected. And finally, I've never had a guest on my show for whom I've had more audience questions before. I have 6 pages of just audience questions. That's not even counting mine. So I'm going to get a lot of playtime to those. I'm going to interweave them in the interview, but especially in the last part would be mostly audience questions. So Let's jump right in. And for those of us who may have or may not have seen the previous interview, I would say I'm trying to not repeat anything that we discussed there. So we're only barely going to touch about the singularity. And the only other repetitive question would be this. Cory, for those of you who may not be familiar with you and your work, if I were to ask you to introduce yourself in 1 or 2 sentences, what's the best way to do that? Who is Cory Doctorow?
Sure. I usually say that I'm a writer and an activist and a journalist. I do some little academic stuff around the side. I'm a visiting professor of computer science at the Open University and a visiting professor of practice of library science at the University of North Carolina and a research affiliate at the MIT Media Lab. I'm Canadian by birth. I also have British citizenship. I live in Southern California. And I'm one of the owners and editors of a website called Boing Boing that's pretty well known. And I work with the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Yes, fantastic. And we're going to touch upon many of those elements together. So let's jump right in. The latest 2 books that I read by you, actually, I listened to one and I read to the other, but let's start with Walkaway. Walkaway, in my opinion, honestly, is, and I hate to say that, but it's kind of like the best science fiction novel that I have ever read in my life, because it literally was so engaging and so perhaps relevant to our situation in our life, and sort of captures that feeling that we're all struggling with, if I can put it this way. So what is Walkaway about?
Well, it's very nice of you to have said. Walkaway is a novel about, I say it's an optimistic disaster novel. It's about people who are behaving really well in times of a crisis. And philosophically, I would say that it's a novel that tries to replace the idea that there's 2 kinds of people. The good people who rise to the crisis and the bad people who form mobs and come and eat their neighbors during a crisis. And it tries to replace that story that we tell ourselves with a more nuanced story, which is that there's 2 kinds of people who believe that people are mostly good, and people who believe that there's 2 kinds of people, the good ones and the ones who are going to turn into a mob and come and eat them when disaster comes. And the villains in the story aren't the people who turn into mobs and eat their neighbors when the disaster comes. It's the people who are so convinced that the people around them are going to turn into mobs and come and eat their neighbors, that everything that we do to try to remediate the disaster, and the disaster in this book is the combination of automation, economic wealth concentration, and climate change, climate catastrophe, that they get in the way of the recovery. They just can't believe that the people who are getting on with the recovery are actually just getting on with the recovery, and they're convinced that they can't peacefully coexist. They sort of turn out to be right. It's a novel set mostly in Ontario and the Niagara Escarpment in and around Toronto. And it's about walkaways, people who walk away from a civilization that no longer needs them, where automation has rendered them economically redundant, who found a parallel civilization on climate racked brownfield sites, environmentally collapsed brownfield sites, where they use stolen software and automation to build a kind of fully automated luxury communist parallel civilization, where they have these giant luxury resorts that sort of self-maintain, where anyone can come along and be a part of things, and where a lot of the problems of scarcity are solved not through material abundance, although there's some of that, mostly through computational coordination, where so much of what we think of as scarcity is the fact that in order to have a drill, you need to go and buy like a minimum viable drill from a hardware store somewhere and stick it in a drawer for the 3 times a year you need to make a hole. And so now you've got this like double problem. You've sunk your capital into this shitty drill, and you've also, you know, absorbed some of your available space to house the shitty drill and some of your mental space to remember where it is the next time you need to make a hole. And under conditions of computational coordination, it may just be that the drill like migrates to your hand at the minute you need it, and it's the greatest drill ever, and it's gathering telemetry on its use. And when it reaches the end of its duty cycle, it like gracefully decomposes back into the material stream and is replaced by a drill that embodies all of the new knowledge we can derive from the telemetry it generated in its last existence. And it's this kind of incredible abundance. And you know, I've been trying to make this idea very crisp and you know, something that you can sum up in a pithy sentence. We approximate abundance with the idea that you have one of everything you'll need. And if you imagine how that would work in our society, think about going backpacking in a poor nation where the toilets don't have toilet paper. And you've got a roll of toilet paper in your backpack. And everywhere you go, you've got this grubby roll of toilet paper you carry around for yourself. That's the abundance we have today. Everyone's got a car in the garage. Everyone's got a drill in a drawer. Everyone's got a rusting lawnmower in the garage, in the backyard, right? And that's everybody carries around the toilet paper with them. Under conditions of abundance, you have this kind of, you stop having to think about or manage the materials. And there's this like bizarro world version that we get from market economies, which is that you don't own everything and you rent everything and nothing is your property. And, you know, you get it on this just-in-time software as a service basis, but it's not yours and you have no say in it. It's completely undemocratic. And the only way you can affect its outcome is to like change which merchant you buy things from. But there's another version of it, which is the kind of communal, cooperative, communally owned thing that is under democratic control.
Fantastic. And can you perhaps expand a little bit more about, even if you will, the history of the concept of walkaway, because it's a very novel concept, and why in the first place do those people have to actually be walkaways? Why can't you do that as part of the current system? I mean, why not in the default world?
Sure. Well, so the kind of proximate inspiration, that the book that most heavily influenced Walkaway and that made me really think it through was a book by Rebecca Solnit, a nonfiction history book of disasters called A Paradise Built in Hell. Solnit, probably best known for coining the term mansplaining, but she's also this brilliant historian. In fact, the term mansplaining comes from a time when she'd written a wonderful essay about a historical fact, and she met a man who said, "Oh, I read this incredible essay in this magazine," and proceeded to explain it to her, and she kept saying, "I wrote that article. No, I wrote that article," and he just couldn't hear her. So that's where the term comes from. Paradise Built in Hell is this very closely argued, very finely researched history of disasters and catastrophes, where she goes through these contemporaneous first-person accounts from the disasters. So things like the newspapers and journal entries published and written by survivors of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, or the contemporary first-person accounts of survivors of the Katrina disaster in New Orleans, or the Haiti earthquake. And she identifies this kind of pervasive mythology about disasters that is at odds with the lived experience of the disasters. And the pervasive mythology is that in times of disaster, the bestial nature of humanity is revealed. And that's when the pores come and eat their social betters. And the reality is that disasters are this moment where the kind of background refrigerator hum of petty grievance stops and leaves behind a ringing silence. And in that silence, you realize that whatever it was that you and your neighbor were fighting about is not all that important, and that it's far more important to go and dig your neighbor out of the gravel, right, out of the rubble. And that the elites can't believe that that's what's going on. The elites are convinced that somewhere out there in the dark, the pores are eating each other and coming for them next. And there's a phenomenon sociologists call elite panic, which is the kind of preemptive strike against poor people in times of crisis that makes the crisis worse. And, an example of this from her book is that after the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, General Funston was convinced of two incorrect facts. The first one was that he knew how to use controlled demolitions to create fire breaks that would prevent fires from spreading. Turns out he didn't. He set fire to San Francisco. The other one was that he couldn't trust the poor people whose neighborhoods he just set on fire to go and fight the fires. And so he deployed his troops from the Presidio, from the barracks in the Presidio, to guard the Mission, the neighborhood that had been where the poor people lived in San Francisco, from potential looters. And he burned down a quarter of San Francisco as a result. There were no verified accounts of looting, except for two of the soldiers who've been set to watch the Mission, who realized that a cigar store was about to be engulfed in flame, and so they smashed the windows and stole the cigars. And so this is like emblematic of how we feel about disasters and how disasters play out, and how those two things can rub up against each other. And fiction has something to answer for here. There is a kind of narrative convenience to the belief in humanity's bestiality, right? If you're a pulp writer like me, if you write science fiction that's plot driven, it's very tempting to say, okay, well, let's combine man versus man and man versus nature and have a story where the earthquake knocks your house down and then your neighbors come over to enslave you, right? And then you get like two for the price of one. And you can see this playing out in the actual world today, where the far right has gone in one heartbeat from climate denial to eco-fascism. And, as we record this in mid-August, we have just lived through a series of white supremacist mass shootings that left behind manifestos by authors who describe themselves as eco-fascists, and who basically take as their gospel that when climate change arrives, there won't be enough for all of us, not enough places to live, not enough arable land. And so we have to decide who we're going to exterminate when the crisis arrives. The reality is that when the crisis arrives, we are going to need all hands on deck. We are going to need 100% of all human labor for 3 or 4 generations to come to build the seawalls, to tend to the sick and the wounded, to rebuild, to elevate, to move cities, to remediate climate change, to do all the work that's needed. And this belief, this eco-fascist belief, is the thing that might end up costing us the future of our species. And there's a thing in cognitive, in behavioral economics called the availability heuristic, which is that things that are easier to imagine are things that are assessed as having higher probabilities of occurring, right? The more vividly you can imagine something, the more you worry about it. And a generation or two of things like The Walking Dead have left us with this belief that when the lights go out, our neighbors are not our salvation. They're our adversary. They're the primary risk that emerges from this. And so the point of Walkaway is not just to tell that story. And it turns out that I think it makes a pretty good pulp story to tell a story where the arguments that you have with the people that you love are the source of your drama, rather than the fights that you have with the people you hate. If you have a fight with someone you don't like, that's it, you're done, right? You have a shouting argument with someone on the highway who cuts you off, you're done. But if you have an argument around the Christmas dinner table with your uncle or your sister, it doesn't matter who wins, right? That fight is never over, right? Like, even if you win, you spend the rest of your life being haunted by it. And even if you lose, you spend the rest of your life being haunted by it. So telling a pulp story that's about disagreements between people who love each other turns out to be much more dramatic than mere disagreements among people who hate each other. But that said, the other thing that having a story about the heroic nature of pulling together in time of crisis is one of the ways to change the availability heuristic, to make people understand that when the lights come out, the thing your neighbor is coming over with is a casserole dish, not a shotgun. And that your optimal game theoretical response to things going wrong is throw in with your neighbors, not build a barrier to keep them out. And that to me is like also an insurance fund for my own future, because it's not pessimistic to assume that things will break down. Complex systems, they have failure modes, right? Believing that your complex system is never going to break down doesn't make you an optimist. It makes you an idiot, right? That's what prompted the engineers who built the Titanic to decide that it didn't need lifeboats, right? The most optimistic, hopeful thing you can believe is that when things break down, we can get them running again, right? That the machine that we built is a machine that we can start up again. Part of our story today is a lapsarian story, that once we were great, and we have fallen from grace. And the heroic achievements of the past that gave us our industrial civilization are outside of our grasp today. That we are like the crew on a generation ship in an old Heinlein novel, and we've forgotten that we're even on a spaceship. And, we can't pilot it and we can't run it. And one day in the life support systems are breaking down one at a time. And we are doomed to fall into a sun. That even if we can locate the control room again and kick the bones of the captain out of the command chair and sit down, we could never pilot the ship because we have fallen from grace. And the reality is that we are the same flawed and noble people that we've always been, and that we have the power to steer the ship, right? We have the power when it gets off course to put it back on course, but that it requires cooperation, not fights to seal off parts of the ship and pump out the oxygen so that we're not fighting over the dwindling reservoirs of food generated by our failing life support system.
Mm-hmm. And that's, by the way, brilliantly said, which is where, again, I can see your sort of activist position take over, because, as you said very well yourself, you have to sort of envision or have that narrative, have that positive story in order to make that future scenario more likely to happen actually in reality, right? So, but let me ask you this, isn't that the sort of a very kind of idealistic anarchist position of walking away from society, walking away from the state? I mean, what about the nation state? It's been around for at least 500 years, and basically so far it has kept our civilization more or less going. You could make an argument that it has created, healthcare and prosperity and prolonged longevity and better education and women's suffrage and human rights and all of those benefits, right? So do we want to dispense with all of that?
No, and not at all. And certainly climate chaos and the coming climate crisis is going to require coordination, right? And the purpose of the state, or the instrumental purpose of the state, is to provide coordinative scaffolding, right? It's to minimize the transaction costs of working together, right? Enforcing contracts, punishing defectors, creating rules of the road, including human rights and so on, that act as a check on bad actors, on dysfunctional, short-sighted activity, and so on. And the you're right that the answer is not to just dispense with that. Although a lot of what we do today through central coordination can be coordinated well at the periphery, right? Or with fewer centralized components. You know, once an encyclopedia required a multinational corporation in a big building and, you know, investors and shareholders and so on. Now it's Wikipedia. And Wikipedia still has an institutional bureaucracy. It still has points of centralization. It has fewer ones, right? And if you want to, and this is good news, right? Because it frees up the state. It frees up our administrative enterprise to do more ambitious things, right? So if we can build an encyclopedia with the kind of administrative overheads that we used to devote to a really ambitious bake sale, then we can take the resources that we used to spend administering encyclopedias and use them to administer more ambitious projects like climate remediation. And, you know, I've recently become very enamored of ideas like modern monetary theory, which envision a very technocratic, centralized role for the state in using money as a lever for deploying human capital, and particularly when combined with a national jobs guarantee, to deploy human capital in service of climate remediation, service of things like a Green New Deal. And you know, the reason...
a very new Keynesian kind of a take on the world. And I have to say, I subscribe to it myself very much.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I actually just did an interview with the Modern Monetary Theory podcast, and we were talking about Keynes. And Keynes had this idea that if you wanted to stimulate the economy, you could pay half of the unemployed people to dig holes and the other half to fill them in. And we're kind of doing that on a long time scale, right? Our ancestors spent a century digging holes to get out the hydrocarbons. And now we're going to spend a century digging holes to put the hydrocarbons back into them. The difference between us and Keynes is that in Keynes's model, the worst thing that happens is you fail to stimulate the economy. In our model, what happens is that we render our planet uninhabitable by human beings. That, you know, Keynes was more prescient than we give him credit for, perhaps. The thing is that for states to function as centralized coordinating actors, they need to have legitimate truth-seeking exercises. The truth-seeking is at the center of the technocratic job of the state. And the state has two jobs. It has a political job and a technocratic job. And here's a way of thinking through that. In the UK, the drug czar used to be a guy named David Nutt. And David Nutt's a psychopharmacologist, very eminent researcher in his field. And he came up with a very novel and extremely well thought through way for determining how to rate and schedule different recreational drugs, right? Which ones would be rated as most dangerous and which ones would be rated as least dangerous and so on. And that way was that he convened a panel of experts and he charged them with rating each drug based on how harmful it was to individuals who took them, the families of those individuals, and our wider society. And then he did different statistical modeling where he weighted those three priorities differently. And what he found was that in some cases, because the drugs were so dangerous or so harmless or so in the middle, that their rating would be stable, regardless of how you set your priorities. But in other ones, they might be much more harmful to the individual than they are to their families or wider society. And deciding whether protecting individuals from harm or protecting society from harm is more important, that is a political choice. And so he would then go to Parliament and he would say, you tell us what our national priorities are. We'll tell you where the drugs go, right? So that is the political function of the state, deciding what the priorities are,
wow,
and the empirical truth-seeking function of the state in one go. And here's how it goes wrong. He concluded on this basis that marijuana was much safer than alcohol. And they fired him because he refused to say that alcohol was less dangerous than marijuana. So
wow,
truth-seeking under conditions of inequality and market concentration becomes an auction and not an empirical function, right? When industries are very concentrated, they command monopoly rents, right? They make a lot of money. They have a much lower coordination problem, right? If you remember that photo of Trump's tech summit after he took office in Trump Tower, everyone who ran Western tech sit around a single boardroom table, right? So when everyone who runs an industry sits around one table, you can all sit down and decide what your priorities are, right? So you have a much lower coordination problem in arriving at a single lobbying position, and you have much more profits that you can use to drive that. And so what ends up happening is that every time we ask an empirical question, the answer to that question is cabined off by whether or not it gores a rich person's ox. So you might remember, I know you're in Canada, after Justin Trudeau took office, he gave a talk to a bunch of hydrocarbon criminals in which he said, no nation is going to leave $3 trillion worth of oil in the dirt, right? And so this was his defense of building pipelines and continuing to extract the tar sand hydrocarbons, which is the filthiest source of energy in the world and is a crime against humanity to dig up. Which is not to say that the people
lost me on that pipeline project, and we knew he's going to approve it from the outset, the way he set it up. I mean, the moment he bought it, basically.
Right. But the thing is that, like, we have this false dichotomy where either we take the people who depend on the tar sands and we allow them to continue to live with dignity and to feed their families, or we save the planet, right? But not only can we do both, we must do both. Right, we must build not just because it builds the constituencies for saving the planet and continuing for it to be habitable by our species, but also because it's the moral and ethical thing to do. Right, that the idea that we would build a Titanic and decide not to put enough lifeboats in it for everybody, just for the people who are on the upper deck, is profoundly not just a profound act of engineering foolishness, but it's immoral. Right? We need as many lifeboats as there are passengers. And so this truth-seeking exercise, it's easy to understand why JT chose to burn the world down. And it was because his party can't get reelected if hydrocarbon profiteers don't give him money. Right? And the reason that we can, that he can command money from them is that their industry is concentrated. It's barely regulated. They control their regulators. They capture their regulators. And they have so much money that they can afford to give him some. Now, of course, they're going to give most of their money to white supremacists like Jason Kenney, right? So it was a shitty, stupid bet for him to have made. And that's why Canada is about to have a white supremacist government that will be climate-denying, hyper-nationalist white supremacists who hasten the demise of our species. And it was a stupid, terrible miscalculation to make. It was Clintonian in the worst sense, absolute cynical triangulation for him to have done it. But you can see why, right? And you can see why the state becomes dysfunctional under conditions of concentration and inequality. And concentration and inequality are related, right? Like, the more concentrated you are, the richer you get, the more unequal society becomes, the more money there is to pay for concentration or for lobbying, the more unequal you become, the worse our tax rules get, and so on, right? So they all like connected to each other. And so the reason the walkaways walk away is because they no longer have a legitimate state. They have to end up building a parallel state. And really, like, we do have to weaken the grip of the wealthy, right? And this is one of the things about modern monetary theory, is that it holds that the way that we fund state programs is not through taxation, but we still have to tax rich people so that they won't be so powerful, right? So that their grip on our policy outcomes does not distort our policies away from truth and towards the inconvenient untruths that allow them to continue to get richer.
Well, let me take and throw in an audience question here from Cynthia Stewart, because it's kind of in that vein of thinking. It would expand your thought a little more further, but perhaps we can keep it a little shorter because I want to move on to the other.
I understand. Sure. Yeah.
So Cynthia Stewart is asking, Mr. Doctorow, do you believe that exponentially increasing technology will inevitably lead to a post-scarcity world economy? Because you're talking about the post-scarcity as a feature of the walkaways, and the default world, for some of the reasons perhaps that you just mentioned, are living in scarcity and perhaps want to retain that feature. It's like a foundational feature, if you will.
So abundance is a function of at least three factors. So one is our material science, right? Like, do we have enough sand to continue to make concrete, right? That's actually a problem. India's had all the sand stolen. Another one is our praxis, right? Like if you look at a contemporary building today, the embodied labor, material, and energy is an infinitesimal fraction of a building that encompasses comparable amount of cubic meterage from, say, 100 years ago. That's true of cars. That's true of most goods, right? That they just we do more with less. But then the third one, oh no, I beg your pardon. There's at least four. So the third one is what we want, right? Keynes famously, he wrote this essay that predicted that by today, that people would be working 15-hour weeks. And
the economic prospects of our grandchildren, I think.
That's right. Yeah, that's the one. And there are many ways to explain why that's not true, but one of them is that we want more, right? And that's not, and some of that's down to this systematization of marketing, right? Which makes us like marketing is the science of making you want stuff. But some of it is down to some pretty legitimate things, like we want all of our children to live to adulthood now, and that's like some of us have responded to that shift by having fewer children. I've got one kid. My parents had two. Their parents had three. My grandparents came from cohorts of 10. So there's some
with my wife, for example.
Right. But some people, for the same reasons that my great-grandparents wanted 10 kids, also want 10 kids. And unlike my great-grandparents expected all those kids to live to adulthood, it is not terrible to expect all your kids to live to adulthood. So some of it is what we want, right? Marie Kondo has built a career out of convincing us that all we want is like a single smooth river stone that reminds us of our mother. To quote Cory Doctorow, and if that were the case, if we all became Kondoized, then we could have material abundance, right? If you don't want much, it's easy to satiate yourself. And then finally, there's distribution, right? That thing that I was talking about with drills before, right? That kind of square, what we have, how we use it, what we want, and how we distribute it. Those four things determine whether or not we have abundance. And merely increasing our praxis doesn't get you there, right? If praxis does improve the distribution question, with the more computing we have, the more efficiently we can allocate. But it doesn't. It's not the final answer, because if we convince people they want more, if we convince people that you're not living under conditions of abundance unless you've got a roll of toilet paper in your backpack, then you could manufacture as much as you possibly wanted, and everyone would want one of everything and a house big enough to put it in. You'd be in a Red Queen's race, right? Like you see this in our cities where abundance is translated into single family dwellings. And then you have wider roads to accommodate more people living in more dispersed areas, which means that people have to live further away, which means that they need wider roads, which means that, and so on and so on and so on. There's another version of that, which is kind of like the Hong Kong version, where you have a really nice flat, and then you have this super vibrant street life that's just outside your door. And, you cook if you want to, if it's for pleasure. But mostly what you do is you go out of an evening and you sit out on the sidewalk at a cafe or a bistro, you see your neighbors and you chat and you have a deliciously prepared meal and so on. And you don't have to do the dishes because we've got, an efficient distribution of labor. Obviously, Hong Kong is having problems that are distinct from that. But that is like one model of living. Not incidentally, one of the other things that does is it crowds people into a small amount of space and leaves everything else for habitat, which, if you care about the climate or animals or even arable land, that's pretty good news.
Yeah. And by the way, I got reminded that in support of what you said previously about the sort of dog kind of a Niccolo Machiavelli presupposition that in a case of emergency, that's what the world going to be inevitably like. I remember when the blackouts happened here in Toronto, we honestly, and that's not, kind of like a major apocalyptic event, but it was like down for at least 3 or 4 days, if I remember. And we had the best time with our neighbors. We brought out candles on the sort of the platform between the units. We brought out food, we brought out wine, and we ended up staying up until 3 a.m. Someone brought guitars, people were singing, and it was the best sort of neighborly fun that we've had before and after. It's never been so much fun. And we didn't have electricity, no phones, nothing. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that's if you read Paradise Built in Hell, that's actually a pretty common experience. That was the experience in the Bronx and the New York blackouts. And the thing is that there are some peripheral incidents, right? That like during the Bronx, there was, blackouts in the Bronx, there were some looting. But mostly what there was exactly what you described. People going, oh, well, if my freezer is broken down, I better have a barbecue and invite the neighbors over.
Right. And connecting that to abundance, which is how I remembered it, is that actually you can make an argument that even though we didn't have electricity and no cell phones and no internet and none of that, we in a way had more abundance of happiness and about things that made us happy than the abundance before that, which was kind of more materialistic, more electronic, more technological, which we lost when the blackout happened. And yet we were kind of suddenly alive and we had different kind of abundance. So sometimes you actually have to lose some technology or something, I don't know, in order to gain another abundance.
Well, and that's the third corner, right? That's marketing, right? Like deciding what we want is a big piece of it. If everybody wants to live on a giant country estate, then we run out, right? If people instead want to take holidays, want to be able to afford and also take holidays on beautiful, rural lakeside cabins or whatever, we can probably figure out how to do that, right? We can probably figure out how to rotate the use of those things in ways that, that are efficient and that give everyone that kind of abundance. It's the fallow resources that are misallocated by market forces that are driving some of our scarcity.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you that sort of last idea here connected to Walkaway, because it's sort of a very connected to my traditional audience of transhumanists and singularitarians. And that's the idea of sort of like walking away from your body, if you will. Right? And that's got a lot to do with sort of human enhancement or life extension and perhaps even immortality. So let me ask you this. What's your take on sort of the idea of transhumanism and sort of immortality and so on?
There's a really good essay by Joey Ito, who runs the Media Lab, called Reducing Reduction.
Yeah,
Resisting Reduction.
I interviewed him on, well, we didn't speak so much on that particular, but we spent an hour. First I interviewed him, then he interviewed me, and it was
fun. Yeah, Joey, I mean, he's I think nominally my boss at the Media Lab. His grants fund my work at EFF, so I'm a great fan of Joey, and his whole family is super interesting. His sister Mimi Ito is the preeminent sociologist of how young people use networks. She runs a lab at UC Irvine, did the MacArthur Digital Youth Project. They're quite a power family. They're really interesting characters, all of them. I am skeptical of transhumanism for many reasons. One is that it's got some pretty obvious card palming going on, where there's this kind of like, well, once we get to the difference in degree, we'll get the difference in kind, right? If we do enough of this, whatever it is, machine learning or neuronal replacement with technological apparatus, the way Kurzweil talks about it, like the where you one piece of the brain at a time, we're replacing them with machines to help people who have disabilities or injuries. And then eventually we get to this place where something happens, big black box, and what comes out the other side is immortal software-based, software platform life forms that are continuous with the meat people who came before them. And I just think that this is under theorized, like there's just the idea that we should take this at face value is problematic because no one can explain what's happening in the black box, and it starts to look like magic underpants thinking. And step one, collect underpants. Step two, something. Step three, profit. also because there is, I am always aware in my own thinking and others that when you hear something that is bold and unlikely or improbable, that requires a big leap of faith that nevertheless feels attractive, one of the things that's worth asking is, is this comforting, right? Like, have you overweighted the likelihood that it's true? Because if it were true, it would be great. And, you know, this is a reason that I'm skeptical of my own belief in modern monetary theory, because it certainly solves a lot of problems if it turns out that it's true. And it's a thing that I wrestle with, and same with my theory of human action, and particularly of transhumanism. You know, when I think about why people have faith in other transcendental belief systems, like Judeo-Christian religion, for example, Abrahamic religion, it's pretty clear that it's comforting, right? That the belief in an eternal afterlife.
It's an answer.
Sure.
And people are also for that answer.
But not just an answer, right? Because at least in the case of Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic belief, the punishment of sinners in the afterlife is profoundly comforting, right? Because it takes all the injustice of our temporal world and corrects it in the eternity that follows. And so the injustice pales in comparison, right? Just read Dante for a sense of like how sadistically pleasurable, like how atavistically pleasurable it is to contemplate that at the end times, eternity will be occupied by your enemies and tormentors, facing pain that puts your pain in the shade, and that goes on forever and ever. And so you can see why it would feel comforting. You can understand the social conditions that produce it. There's a kind of class war critique of it that says that, you know, it helps the ruling class to tell poor people that their justice comes in the afterlife. You know, there's that famous song, long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when you ask for something to eat, they will answer in voices so sweet, you will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky. Live and pray, live and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die, right? Like you can see why there are many forces that conspire to make that belief one that's normalized, in the same way that, you know, reactionary beliefs about the intrinsic superiority of some people, which are at the core of reactionary thought, right? The idea that some people are born better than others, and that society is right when the best people govern the lesser people. And that's the foundational belief of all right-wing thought, whether that's, you know, Christian fundamentalism and the belief in dominionism, that men should be regulating women and men should be regulating children, or, you know, libertarian thought that says that bosses should regulate workers, or monarchist thought that says that kings should regulate and aristocrats should regulate the low-born. All of these beliefs, that's the thing that unifies them. And you can see why eugenics and other forms of pseudoscience that reinforce that belief have so much currency, right? Because they have a constituency that lobbies for them. Right, that the richest people on earth get richer if we all believe that eugenics is true, right? That good blood is the like underlying condition of the human species.
Okay, let's move on to, because time is advancing here very quickly.
Sure.
And I love our conversation. I've never heard you sing before. That was brilliant. So let's talk about Radicalized.
Sure.
Okay, that's the other book that I just finished reading. Loved it too. But it's not a novel. It's 4 separate stories. So tell us what's Radicalized about.
Sure. Well, you know, I call them my Trump derangement syndrome novellas. I had not planned on writing them. I actually wrote them kind of therapeutically while working on the 3rd Little Brother book, which I've just finished. And I wrote them kind of to deal with my anxiety about what's going on in the world. You know, it is a very frightening time. And
let me just interrupt you here and kind of tweak a little bit and perhaps address the subtitle, which is going to move into this vein perhaps that you're talking about, because it says 4 tales of our present moment. So I wanted to ask you very much, and I think you're already talking about this. What's our present moment, Cory? Because you're sort of identifying the big trends and sort of extrapolating it.
Right. Well, so, you know, we are on the brink of a major crisis, right? That is our climate crisis. The climate crisis is exacerbated by inequality. And inequalities underlying philosophy, what I just alluded to, this belief in the intrinsic superiority of some people, that one of the conclusions that you reach if you're indoctrinated all your life about the intrinsic superiority of some people is that if we are going to run out of stuff, that we know who we should jettison, right? Who's excess on the voyage, and who's needed to steer and maintain the ship. And so you get this combination of anxiety and ecofascism and authoritarianism. And, when you add to the kind of underlying racist ideology of people that is just there as a baseline, that everybody is subject to some prejudices, some people have more prejudice than others, and then you add to that inequality where basically we say, what looked like an eternity in which everyone would have their basic needs met, right? The 30 glorious years after the two wars, right? The French called them les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, where we built welfare states, where we had social mobility, where someone like my father, who, was a refugee born to a farmer, who was illiterate, could come to Canada and end up with a PhD. And, you can just see it in there's this amazing thing where when you stand, well, my grandfather's dead now, but when you stood my grandfather, my father, and me next to each other, we were like a bar chart of the impact of nutrition on overall development. Because my dad's a head shorter than me, and his dad was a head shorter than him. My dad was born, my grandfather was born on a farm during a famine. My father was born to parents who were displaced people and, spent years knocking around Europe after the war, going from camp to camp until he made it to Canada. And then I was born at Women's College Hospital in downtown Toronto and raised with the best nutritional and scientific upbringing that we can imagine. And we're just like, right? And so what felt like everybody having a seat at the table, and that we're just going to keep adding to the table and adding seats, has been revealed over 40 years of neoliberal thought to actually be a game of musical chairs, where we're taking seats away, right? And when you add to that the other strain from the 30 glorious years, which was the full enfranchisement and equality of all people, we then say, by the way, people who've just realized that we're going to start taking chairs away from the table, we're also going to let all these other people who never got to sit at the table compete for the chairs that are left. And so you can see how whatever latent prejudice or racism was there, or even overt racism and prejudice was there, suddenly becomes supercharged, because it becomes not about merely the concern that you will be in company of people that you dislike, but the direct competition with those people for the very stuff of life. And so that's the kind of stuff that's going on out in the world, right? And then you add to that we have massive concentration in online technology, right? We have 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4. And that the engineers who build that technology are paid and bonused based on how much we engage with them. And that the only reliable form of behavioral manipulation that tech has arrived at is anxiety. Turns out that it's really easy to induce anxiety. You just fill people's lives with buzzers and terrifying news, and just this just constant barrage that everything else you get adapted to. The people enjoyed playing Pokemon Go for 90 days and then they stopped, right? Except for a tiny rump of people. I think that behavioral modification technology is grossly overstated, except for anxiety-inducing technology. And I think that we can reliably introduce anxiety over long time scales. And so what that means is that we are just barraged by terrifying headlines all day long. That Google takes their phones and they add a drop down of trending searches whenever you tap the search bar, not because anyone ever went to a search bar to find out what other people were searching for, but because trending searches are always whatever's frightening at the moment. And so it sidetracks people from looking up a cookie recipe or trying to find out, what time the bus comes, into reading about the imminent threat of nuclear war, right? Which then leads them to more searches and more searches and more searches. And so we've got this this like hedonic loop where like our technology is sucking us into not a feeling of pleasure that keeps us going, but a feeling of anxiety that keeps us going. And on top of that, all these reasons to be anxious. And they conspire not to just make us feel anxious, but also to make us feel anxious because we can't figure out what is going on. There is no coherent narrative, because coherence is anti-anxious, right? If you know where your pain is coming from, then you can start to formulate a plan to deal with it, or at least anticipate what's happening next. But the minute you are confused about what's going on, then the anxiety goes up. And so all of that is by way of saying, I wrote these stories to try and make sense of it all, right? To construct coherent narratives out of this deliberate chaos that we're living through. Not because they're necessarily comforting, but because if you can name the source of your discomfort, then at least you can start to think about what you'll do next.
Actually, they're pretty discomforting and kind of, in a way, they made me pretty angry at many points, if you will. So like really angry. So let me ask you this though. And you already mentioned some of them, but if you were to sort of rank order the top 3 or 4 most important issues that humanity needs to contend with, that our civilization needs to solve in order to survive and thrive in this century, what would you rank them as?
I would say that, like, from a 10,000 foot perspective, we need to be able to solve collective action problems and make empirical findings about the world. That's it, right? Like, that all of the other problems, inequality, bad technological decisions, climate change, and so on, they are the result of collective action problems and a failure to reveal and legitimately disseminate empirical findings that we can empirically review and validate, right? That we can validate through things like peer review, and that everything falls out of that. And the way that we address it, right, to get at the, like, kind of, well, how does that play out on the, from 100 feet instead of 10,000 feet, is iteratively, right? The better our truth seeking is, right? The more we know, for example, that the amount of tar sands we should burn is 0. The less money tar sand criminals have to spend to convince us to burn tar sands, right? And the less tar sands we burn, the less climate chaos we face. And the less climate chaos we face, the more space we have to build collective action to remediate the existing climate destruction that we've already wreaked on the world. And the more we do that, the more we can use that the cohesion that we develop from that to go after other profiteers and criminals. And the technology that we use to organize that collective action becomes more responsive and legitimate, less surveilling, more private, more accountable, more reconfigurable by its users. The more pluralistic our society is, the more the more legitimate our truth seeking is, and so on. So, like, these are there isn't like one thing that we fix. It's that we have this big loosey-goosey structure, and we need to be pushing on all of its corners, either running from one corner to the next to push it, like pushing one bumper of a car stuck in the snow and then the other bumper going back and forth, or we need to get people in all the corners pushing all at once.
Okay, but let me ask you how these 2 suggestions of yours play with respect or within sort of 2 or 3 other examples of the most urgent crisis that other people have suggested on my show before and otherwise, of course.
Sure.
And those 3 others are things like nuclear proliferation and the danger of nuclear war, artificial intelligence, and technological unemployment. And you've already mentioned climate change, so let's put that aside. But tell me how these 2 would play within those 3 examples.
Well, so I think, like, technological unemployment is grossly overstated. First of all, the methodology is really stupid. When you look at, like, the thing about how, like, all Americans are truck drivers and truck drivers will be automated, it just turns out to be grounded in garbage science. So the category that the Department of Labor uses for truck driver includes like people who drive long haul trucks that are more amenable to automation, and then people who like do short run delivery vans in cities, which are super hard to automate. And so like this isn't a unitary category, but also like stipulate we make every vehicle self-piloting, which again, super long way away. That just frees up more labor to build seawalls and take care of sick people who've been overheated by climate change, and like do all of the other work that needs doing. Like there's this like look at the demographic crisis, right? We have aging societies, and in the absence of good automation and coordination, we're going to need an ever-expanding pool of workers to care for people in their senescence. And we also, that senescence is prolonged, or rather that care period is prolonged, because even before people are senescent, we take them out of the labor pool. It's like, well, I can think of a lot of ways to solve that apparently markets can't solve. Like, for example, you could take the people who are not senescent but are occupying good jobs of working age people, and you could put them to work taking care of senescent people, right, who need more care. The fact that like our economy can't figure out how to create those jobs doesn't mean that jobs aren't needed. It just means that our spreadsheet is broken, right? So we get a better spreadsheet to allocate that human capital. That
would be very much to what Tim O'Reilly suggested when I interviewed him on my show about technological unemployment. But what about AI? I mean, you have people from Bill Gates to Elon Musk to even the late Dr. Stephen Hawking, Steve Wozniak, all those people who, I mean, Elon called it like the summoning of the demon and so on, right?
Yeah.
So what about AI, and how those two things would play within the realm of AI as the arguably potential major issue that humanity will have to contend with in this 21st century?
So if we're talking about statistical inference engines, right, like just, like supervised and unsupervised machine learning, the way that becomes like general AI is super magic underpantsy, right? Like we don't know, like no one has a credible story about how you go from like being reasonably good at statistical inference to then being able to, I don't know, take over the universe and turn it into paper clips or whatever. And when you look at
Joshua Bach called, when I interviewed Joshua Bach, he called AI statistics on steroids, basically.
Yeah, sure. And when you look at Musk, for example, like I mean, it's dangerous to play armchair psychologist, but I think that if you want to see the transhuman colony organism that treats humans like inconvenient gut flora and that Musk created but he can't get out of, it's called a limited liability corporation, right? I think Musk is just projecting his own, fears and anxieties about firms. And, it's the same reason the Victorians were obsessed with Frankenstein's monster, right? They saw in the parable of Frankenstein's monster something that resonated with their own fears and anxieties about industrialization. And, a lot of the times we're not ready to confront what we're actually afraid of. And so we get afraid of the symbol that stands in for it. But, Musk is clearly a deeply unhappy person who hates the jobs that he's involved with, that he's created for himself, can't get away from without suffering both economic and reputational damage, and just like won't confront the reality. I mean, I got into an argument with him on Twitter once where he was claiming that he was a utopian socialist in the mode of Ian Banks. I was like, I knew Banks. I'm pretty sure that he would be pretty impatient with someone who's in trouble with the National Labor Review Board for union busting in his own factory. He was like, but I read Banks, and there are no unions in the culture. I'm like, yeah, because the culture is made up of like, solar system sized spaceships piloted by AIs that have 1 trillion people living on them and go faster than the speed of light. And he said, well, if you could see a Tesla factory, he would understand that we don't need unions either. And I'm like, eking out incremental benefits in the production of electric cars is not directly comparable to creating faster than light civilization, solar system sized civilization ships piloted by AIs that are billions of times smarter than humans. At which point he called me beneath contempt and blocked me, and which is totally true. But I think that like you can see Musk's anxiety about the trap he built for himself in his fears about technology, because the empirical basis for his fears aren't there, right? If you want to see statistics on steroids ruining people's lives, it's not because the AI has taken up arms against us. It's because machine learning provides empirical face wash to bias practices, right? It like in the same way that risk hedging equations allowed quants on Wall Street to head off all criticism of the brewing subprime crisis by saying you don't understand the math, and until you do, you're not qualified to criticize this. Machine learning is a way to say to people who are pissed off that the cops are making them turn out their pockets 100 times a day, or that the judge just gave them a longer sentence than someone who was whiter and richer than they are. It's a way to say, well, it's the math, right? It's not us, it's the math. If you don't like it, blame the math. That's the real risk that people face from machine learning today. And it's not because machine learning works well, it's because it works badly that we have to worry about machine learning.
Okay, but that's today. So are you saying to project this, let's say, because Ray Kurzweil says that by 2028 we'll have human level AI and so on. Then he has a whole timeline that we discussed a little bit in the last interview. But so are you saying that basically you don't see that happening anytime soon, or you're saying that you don't see that happening at all in this century?
Oh, it might happen, but if it does, the idea that the major concern will be technological unemployment, it's a little weird, right? It's like people who are like, well, someday we'll have big scale quantum computers that
maybe
can
not just technological unemployment, maybe Terminator scenario, right? Maybe they'll come to kill us all.
Well, okay, but here's the thing, right? Like maybe someday someone will prove that we'll solve NP-complete problems, right? Maybe someday someone will build a quantum computer that can factor the products of large primes in tractable time. If that happens, the technological possibilities that we unlock are so far beyond, the mere breaking of cryptography, right? Or any of the other like thing, automating truck drivers out of a job, right? Like this is like worrying that when the railroad comes along, the leather workers who sew the oat bags for horses will be unemployed, right? Well, yes, right? But that is not the major impact of railroads. Like, it's such an impoverished imagination to believe that if this incredible thing happens, that the only thing that's going to happen as a result is that everything will go on as normal, right? We'll continue to have an economy, but all of the assets will be held by, I don't know what, right? Like the guy who invents AI, right? Or the company that holds the patents or whatever. Like the idea that none of the rest of that is going to change, right? Well, someday we'll have nuclear reactors, but how will the king govern once the nuclear reactors are here? Well, like on the way to getting nuclear reactors, also monarchies basically became obsolete. So, I think it's a cute thing to write science fiction about. I think that worrying about it. Yeah, but worrying about it it's really misplaced. There's like so much to actually like on our near-term horizon and even our midterm horizon. And the other thing is that like the future changes based on what we do, right? So the idea that we can predict the future is it's not just wrong, it's fatalistic, right? Whether or not you're predicting a rosy or a terrible future, it is fatalistic because it implies that human action doesn't change the future. Human action, the future arrives based on what we do, not based on the vast forces of history. It's actually a beautiful piece of work on this from my colleague Ada Palmer, who is a science fiction writer, but also a Renaissance.
I tried to get her on my podcast. She hasn't responded yet.
She is amazing, has her fingers in a million pies, and also struggles with some pretty serious health problems that she's very public about. And so she is extremely jealous of her time, and I'm sure it's nothing personal. She's just very parsimonious.
I know. I don't take it personally.
Yeah, but she has this Renaissance history class. She studies Renaissance Florence, and in particular the dissemination of forbidden information during the Inquisition. So information about homosexuality, witchcraft, Satanism, blasphemy, heterodoxy, forbidden science, and so on. Her research is amazing. And every year she has her undergraduates at the University of Chicago LARP the election of the Medici's Pope in a multi-week. It's amazing, right? And so she assigns people roles. She tells them, what their priorities are and so on. And then she just sets it in motion. And for weeks, they're like forming alliances and betraying each other. And then finally comes the day when we're going to invest the Pope. And on that day, two of the people who are in the final running are always the same, because the great forces of history dictate that people from these families would always be there in the running for Pope. Two of them are always different, because what the people do when they play the game changes the outcome of the game. And the way that those two people who are always the same end up in the final four is that in an earlier offstage iteration of the game, the pre-Medici iteration of the game, human agency set those forces in motion. So the future changes based on what we do. It's we're not like Harry Seldon is a narrative convenience, not an empirical fact. We are not predicting the future because the future changes based on our actions. Even things that seem relatively certain, right? Like if only 1 million people are born in this year, then in 18 years we know that there won't be more than 1 million 18-year-olds, right? That's pretty certain. The lower bound, though, is completely uncertain. All we know is that between now and in 18 years, between 0 and 1 million people from that cohort will die. And so while we do know what the maximum number is, we don't know what the minimum number is, and it's entirely dependent on how we act, right? What that outcome will be. So even the very certain things are very uncertain.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. And I interviewed, I forgot his name, Brian. He was the former intro futurist, and he said, don't be a spectator.
Brian David Johnson,
exactly. It's been amazing since I did that interview. But Cory, we're kind of, and by the way, for those of you who want to get a little more in depth about Cory's interview idea about the singularity, watch the previous interview that I did with him where Cory called it a progressive apocalypse. So you would learn a lot more about that there if you haven't done so. But Cory, we only have about 24 minutes left. So let's jump into some audience questions.
Sure.
No particular order, but some of them, I've chosen some wacky ones and interesting ones. So hopefully we'll get many different ideas thrown in the pot here. So first of all, Torsten Madsen from Denmark, you get the opportunity to fill a 20-feet container with something of your own choice to explain humanity. The container will be sent in an undefined direction into the universe to see if anyone picks it up. What would you put in that container? And don't plague yourself with considerations like the cheese will not last or will spoil. Everything in this container will last unchanged until it's picked up someday. So what do you put in that container, Cory?
Wow.
You got a great one.
It is a good one. I mean, you put a copy of Wikipedia on a thumb drive, right? That leaves many. I'm amazed that a Dane is measuring things in feet. That's crazy. That leaves many feet remaining in your container. Then you encode everyone's genomes and all the sequence genomes of everything we have, and a seed bank, and probably you'd want the Long Now's Rosetta Stone, right? You want a copy of the Internet Archive, and that petabox. The Internet Archive's whole archive fits in about sort of 6 feet by 10 feet by 4 feet. So that's I think the problem with the 20-foot containers is too big. Once you've got all the digitized stuff in there, it just doesn't occupy much space. And I have a feeling if you take the Internet Archive and you remove the power supplies and the I/O and the networking stuff and just reduce it to solid state storage, that it's also pretty dang small. So we're still in a pretty small space. In fact, what I would do if I had a 20-foot container is I would break it into like 1,000 much smaller containers and send them in 1,000 directions.
David Brink has a book on that topic called Existence, kind of like
sure
sending stuff like that, physical stuff into the space.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely. I think think that if you want to multiplicity is better than singularity, right? That like you want lots and lots of bets, not one big bet. So I would make lots of these things and seed them around. I mean, that's why the Rosetta Stone, the Longnouse Rosetta Stone, why they made thousands of them, not just one of them. Even though they could have, if they just made one, it would have been a lot bigger and would have had room for more detail. But it's also, putting all your eggs in one basket.
I'm going to steal that one. Multiplicity is better than a singularity. I'm going
there you go.
Totally steal that one. It's brilliant. I love it. Okay. So, Michael Garfield, what is the best advice for simply getting along with each other in an era of such extreme polarization?
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what the best is. I do know that, as I said before, that xenophobia is the intersection of two things, of prejudice and panic. And that, I think that we overweight ideological explanations for bad ideas and underweight materialistic ones. If you think about, let's take a polarizing idea that isn't as charged as racism, right, or eugenics. Let's take the flat Earth, right? The arguments for the flat Earth are not better today than they were 20 years ago, right? When you listen to the arguments that people make for the flat Earth, they are not more convincing than the arguments from
they should get more YouTube video play than my podcast has ever had for the last 10 years.
Sure. And I think that when you ask yourself where this comes from, you can either believe in an ideological answer, right? Which includes the ideological answer that maybe YouTube has figured out how to make a mind control ray that makes reasonable people into flat earthers, maybe by leading them down the garden path or something. But I think that the explanation, I believe, is that when truth-seeking exercises are compromised, then you are set loose in a kind of epistemological void, that we are not capable of individually, independently verifying all the things that we need to know for certain in order to live a healthy, happy life in the 21st century, right? Like, even if you do the research to figure out that opioids are not safe and vaccines are, to take an example that's currently a live question. And so that means having statistical literacy to evaluate studies, the media literacy to know which journals are reputable and which ones aren't, and then the domain expertise to evaluate the biomedical claims. Even if that happens, you can evaluate claims about whether the structural members in your house are sufficient to keep your ceiling from falling down on you, or whether the water purification that goes into your water is going to keep you from dying of lead poisoning, or your children suffering permanent brain damage as a result of it, and so on. And when we say it is now all of our responsibility to independently verify every truth claim, because we no longer have a truth-seeking process that we can trust, what we're really saying is pick an expert who sounds reasonable to you and follow their recommendations. And even the experts who are right about some things will be wrong about other things, right? I am an expert in some domains, not an expert in others. Don't listen to me if you're trying to figure out how to fix your plumbing, right? And the problem there is that replacing an empirical, legitimate process with a cult of personality centered around blind faith in experts, or even skeptical faith in experts, leaves us without any way not to agree on what's true, but without any way to agree on how we know whether something is true. And much of our polarization can be laid at the feet of this, whether that's the claims of eugenicists or even the historical claims made by white supremacists, right? There's a lot of historic claims about, European supremacy during the Middle Ages, and how white people invented a bunch of things that are key to our civilization now, and that this is indication of white supremacy and white superiority that we can see through the long historic record. And it's made up, right? Like, this is not actually how the medieval era unfolded. It's based on Tolkien novels, right? It's based on these it's literally, right? Like, those people are like, why are there black people in that story of medieval Europe? Well, because black people were in medieval Europe. In fact, whiteness was not a concept yet in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, the major divisions were Christianity, Jews, Muslims, and heretics, right? That was how people identified one another, not based on their race, not based on their whiteness. And so, this ahistoric belief in a Tolkien-inflected European Middle Ages history is part of the motivated reasoning that is defending white supremacy. And when they are the white supremacists who believe this fanciful version of history are countered with facts, they say facts are unknowable, right? That empiricism is a waste of time. That they defer to experts who sound plausible to them, not an academy that uses adversarial process to root out false claims and elevate true ones.
So is scientific method the answer then?
Yeah, I think, but the scientific method has to be underpinned by legitimacy, right? Like, so the scientific method is embedded in a wider process where, if we say this journal has asked all the people who are credible to peer review this paper, and on that basis, the paper has been published, then we have to believe that the journal is actually doing a good job of it. And where you have things like Apothec in Canada leaning on biomedical researchers who discover that their test subjects, when they're testing Apothec drugs, are getting sick, and saying, if you report your finding, we will sue you for violating your non-disclosure, the scientific method becomes compromised, right? It is not enough to have the method. You have to have the method embedded in an accountable and pluralistic civilization. That otherwise, what you end up with is fragmentation and an inability to assess whether the method is working. I mean, the method is not a way to find the truth as much as it is a way to root out falsehood. And if you put your thumb on the scales with the method, then you can make false beliefs, you can leave false beliefs untainted by skeptical inquiry. And that can lead you down the garden path to eugenics and climate denial and so on, all these other problems that we have.
Yeah. Well, Dementia Donahue asks, 1,000 years from now, what fundamental truth that we believe in today's modern society no longer exists? Is it numeric systems, for example, time, spoken language? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen in 1,000 years. I mean, 1,000 years is an unimaginable time scale to really think about. What's interesting is how much of what happened 1,000 years ago is still recognizable, and how much of it is not, right? Like how little has changed and how much has changed. And thinking both of those through is an exercise in humility about this kind of prediction. Because, even when for example, every now and again, you'll have linguists who will do, fun papers on like what words are still, would be recognizable if you went back in time 1,000 years, and what words are novel. And some words and constructions are extremely long-lived and enduring and stable, and we think of them as very modern, and they're not. I mean, even things like in English, if you think about things like the double negative, Chaucer was very fond of double and triple and quintuple negatives, or contractions like ain't, or even the singular they, using they as a generalist pronoun, all like super common over long time scales. And a lot of what we think of as enduring is actually like super recent. You know, even Anglo-Canadian spellings are super recent. You know, the split with U.S. spellings and so on. And some of them are more recent. Like in some cases, what we think of as U.S. Corruption of historic spellings are actually the preservation of historic spellings, whereas the Commonwealth moved on. And so, you know, even in that like narrow domain that I'm pretty familiar with, so much and so little have changed that I think anyone who claims to know would be making shit up. Now, that said, like if you want to write science fiction, one of the ways to write science fiction is to imagine something that is enduring going away, right? Like, so back to Ada Palmer, her book Too Like the Lightning has the idea that people would tell you what sex they identify as being a taboo, right? Being super louche. It's like walking up to someone and saying, hi, I identify as a man, is like walking up to someone and saying, like, hi, I'm really into anal, right? Like, it's just like, it's completely like oversharing to tell someone what gender you identify as. And, you know, she writes a whole novel around this. It's terrific, in part because it is so shocking and yet also becomes so normal very quickly. And this is why Ada is such a great science fiction writer, is she's an historian. And she knows which things are and are not long-lived and how things are cyclic and so on. You know, if you want to have a super interesting future storytelling idea, you know, I often think that the reason Deus Ex Machina is a legitimate way to end a story if you're an ancient Greek. You know, if you're an ancient Greek, you can say, and then the gods showed up and just fixed everything, is because in the absence of a robust scientific method, many things appear to have no causal origin. You know, you had the theories of spontaneous generation, that leaves were and floating on the river turned into fish, and so on. And so if you don't understand causality, then maybe once again we start to believe in non-causal universes, and all of our storytelling becomes much more non-causal. You know, Carl Schrader wrote a really fun book about this. I'm trying to remember the title. It was about, you know, astro pirates.
Oh yeah.
Do you know which one? Oh, Son of Suns. Son of
Suns, yeah, riding those sort of like motorcycles, which are basically a pipe with a rocket engine in the end and handle.
Yeah, that's right. But and every technology in his universe is evolved by machine learning algorithm separately. So if you take apart a pocket watch and try to figure out how the gears work, and then you take apart another pocket watch to test your hypothesis, they work completely differently. Every manufactured object, and all objects are manufactured because people are living on space colonies run by AIs. Every manufactured object works differently because each one is evolved separately by an AI from scratch. And so there is no way to systematize knowledge. And so people have no systematic knowledge of the universe. It's like, that's a very Schraderian big idea. He does that stuff super well.
I love Karl. He had major impact on me years ago when I did the interview with him after I read The Son of Suns and a few other things, by his sort of take on the singularity as merely a lens, and how the benefit is of having a diversity of lenses in your kit. So after you've used the singularity lens, you leave it and you take a bunch of other lenses, and then you have a diversity of POVs rather than being stuck with a single one.
Totally. Yeah. Karl is one of my favorite people. I've known Karl since I was a teenager. Judith Merrill introduced us because we were both bringing manuscripts to her at the Spaced Out Library in Toronto for critique. And she said, you two should get in a critiquing group together. I was much younger than him. I think I'm about 10 years younger than him. So I was like in my teens and he was in his early 20s. And he was the first person who ever said the word fractal to me, and the first person who ever said the word internet to me, and the first person who ever said the word web to me. Wow. I learned about all of them from Karl. He is really 10, 20 years in the future. Yeah. And he's capable of being both like very cerebral and very visceral at the same time. And his background's amazing. His father is a Mennonite TV repairman.
Yeah, we talked about that. And you know what? This reminds me, I'm going to redouble my effort to bring back, it's been 5 or 6 years since I did the interview with Karl, so I'm going to ask him again, and I'm going to try to get Ada again. I know she's busy, but last time I asked her, maybe last summer. So I'll ask her again. Okay, Cory, we have 7 minutes. So last audience question, and then we do the closing ones from me. So this is my friend Kim Solis from the University of Alberta. It's a bit longer, but I think it's kind of relevant, and it connects with the Ada question about sex, by the way. And it says, NIH Director Francis Collins refuses to sit on male-only medical panels. What does Cory think about male-only futurist or science fiction writer panels? Does Cory share Leonard Cohen's view, quote, I can't wait until the women take over the world, end of quote. It seemed like having women in charge would fix many things and is the way of the future. And we can think of post-genocidal countries like Rwanda as models for a post-apocalyptic world, where, according to him, women are now completely in charge of Rwanda and in other similar societies. Is that the best model or a good model for the future?
Well, I'll tell you that I think that, so it's a complicated question because I am skeptical of neuroessentialism. The median woman and the median man's brain have more in common than the median woman and the 3 Sigma woman's brain. And so the idea that women and men are these like vastly different entities, I don't think it's true, but I think that there's between socialization and biology and other factors that men and women often have different things, like the median woman and the median man have different things to contribute. Notwithstanding that we're 2 guys talking right now, I try not to do all male events. And in particular, I make a point of not doing all male Q&As.
I've seen you do that many times where you ask for non-male or how do you put it? People.
I say, I always start with a question from someone who identifies as a woman or non-binary, and then from someone who identifies as a man or non-binary, and I go back and forth. I actually just read a Twitter thread from a woman who, she gives academic symposiums. She's a scholar. And she requires her audience to peer review their questions before she calls on them. So she calls a 5-minute break after the symposium, which would be, a chair and then say 4 people presenting papers. And she has all of the people turn to their neighbors afterwards, spend 5 minutes workshopping the question, right? Peer reviewing the question. There's a bunch of questions she asks them to consider, like, is my question really, why wasn't I the person on stage? Right? Like that's, like she has all these like pitfalls that you fall into where she says, don't do that. And then she also brings in someone who has local knowledge of the audience because she's speaking to academic groups. There will be someone who knows who all the people in the audience are, who knows who the blowhards are and who the thoughtful people are. So she has them direct the questioning, and she makes each person state for the record whether or not they peer reviewed their question before they can answer it, before they can ask it. So she calls alternately by gender, and she also uses this local knowledge, and she also uses peer review. And the reality is that this is not just a pro forma exercise in fairness, although it is that, and fairness is important. The thing I've learned since I started doing this is I get better questions, right? That I always say as a kind of joke, but also only serious when I call first for questions from women and people identify as non-binary, is that sometimes there's a pause after you announce that because the men in the audience have spent a fraction of the time thinking of a question that makes them sound smart, and the women have been paying attention. And so sometimes you need to give the women a minute to gather their thoughts because they've been paying attention rather than coming up with a way to sound smart. And those questions are often very thoughtful, not always, right? And this is getting to the second part of your question, which is, what if women were running the world? I am prone to believing that authoritarianism is equal opportunity, and that the thing we need to guard against more than anything is authoritarianism and elitism in that kind of reactionary sense, more than the gender of the person who practices it. So there's this very real risk that if you focus merely on gender without asking yourself questions about authoritarianism, that you just elect Margaret Thatcher over and over again, right? And if there's one thing we've learned from Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher and even Kim Campbell, it's that your chromosomal makeup or your gender identity is not fully dispositive of your commitment to human thriving and equality and so on. That it may influence it, but that we really, the qualifying factor should be your political agenda more than your gender. And ideally, if you can find both, then that's great. I'm a donor to both the Elizabeth Warren and the Bernie Sanders campaign, for that reason.
Fantastic. And that, by the way, takes care of another question by an audience member about those two particular campaigns. So sorry for not asking it, but you got the answer anyway.
Sure.
Cory, we're in the last kind of minute or two of our interview. So the two traditional questions that I always end up with is, first, where can users find, our listeners find more about you and your work?
Sure. Well, my personal website is craphound.com, crap like poop and hound like dog. At boingboing.net, you can find me there, and I'm Doctorow on Twitter. And if you're in Toronto and you like Karl Schrader, he and I are headlining the intergalactic stage at Word on the Street this September, I think on the 23rd of September. So you can come see us in conversation there.
Fantastic. And I am going to take a second here. Why Craphound? I always wanted to ask you who.
The first story I sold to a professional market was called Craphound, and I went out and registered the domain.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes sense. But it's such
and I've just been stuck in ever since.
Okay. All right, great. So we're here, the last question. And basically, the question is this: what's the main message or the most important thing that you would like our viewers and listeners to take away from this 90-minute conversation today?
Sure. If they ever write something on my tombstone, I want it to be, "This will all be so great if we don't screw it up." Right? That, like, the reason to care about the destiny of technology in our civilization is not merely because getting it wrong will be terrible, but also because getting it right will be amazing. And, that there's so much more at stake than averting apocalypse. There's ushering in utopia, right? And that, I think, is the message that I want to have taken away.
It could all be so great if we just don't screw it up. Wow. Yeah. That's brilliant. Cory Doctorow, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me back. And I should say that I credit for that to Michael Weinberg from Public Knowledge, who wrote a white paper about copyright and 3D printing called "This Will All Be So Great If We Don't Screw It Up." That's where I got the title.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cory. If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.